Please join me in the responsive reading printed in our bulletin. How long? Not long. My feet are tired and my soul is resting. Let us march on then. How long? Not long. Let us march on then. Good morning, I'm Rob Kirkbride. At about 2 a.m. on October 24th, the train I was riding on from Cologne to Warsaw crossed the border from Germany into Poland. When I woke up that morning, I looked out the window of my train car, and I realized that I had become the first person in my family to return to Polish soil in over 100 years. You see, my great-grandfather, Joseph Kowalski, left Poland during World War I, leaving behind his family. He was a refugee, and as my train rolled through the beautiful Polish countryside, I wondered if he knew the same landscape. Was this place as familiar to him as it was unfamiliar to me? Though I can't imagine what it's like to escape Europe without a penny in one's pocket, as my great-grandfather did, I myself would be staying in a suite at the 5-star Sofitel Warsaw Victoria during my visit to Poland. I do know what it's like to be a refugee. I left the Catholic Church about 6 years ago, and after a year of wandering, I found myself a Catholic refugee here at Fountain Street Church. Amazed to find a place that didn't ask me to leave my religious upbringing at the door. In a very short time, I found my spiritual home here, just as my great-grandfather found his home among the Polish immigrants who made their way to West Michigan. Perhaps you are a refugee today, fleeing from the confusing dogma of a church that doesn't quite fit. Or you're seeking shelter from a life that lacks meaning. I think there's a little refugee in everyone who walks through those doors back there. We are seekers who want to free our mind, grow our soul, and change the world. And if that speaks to you as it did to me, welcome home. Welcome home. This is Fountain Street. You belong here.
Thank you to John Hillebrandt for being with us. He's in town this week playing with David Lockington in the Grand Rapids Symphony. And knowingly or not, John, you have done something really extraordinary this morning that I'm sure is not missed by anyone here. Fountain Street Church has been in the business of liberating people's original innocence with theology for 100 years. And you just took me, and I know everyone here, on a ride through an old melody that has been broken to me for a long time. They'll know we are Christians by our love. And we've tried to put new words on it, and that's worked a little bit, but I've never been able to have the experience I just had, which is to be completely liberated with that piece of music. Oh, it was just so extraordinary. Thank you. One of the other words of that very old lyric is, we are one. We are one in the Spirit. We are one in the Lord, which is another lost word to us. That word actually points back to the king of the Hebrew temple, whose original vision was for that one powerful human to make sure that the rivers of Eden would flow out to all who had need. To be one with that kind of generosity. I bring with me two readings this morning, one of them from the Gospels, and one of them from a more modern voice, the African-American poet Lucille Clifton. We'll begin with the Gospel, but before I do, I want us to remember that this week we celebrate the moment in American history, which is Selma and the March to Montgomery, and the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. For those of you who may not have been alive at the time in which the march from Selma to Montgomery happened, there is a bridge which the forces of darkness, those who would believe that things like Jim Crow and slavery are appropriate social order, attempted to prevent the march from Selma to cross. Dr. King and the many thousands who gathered to make that march believed it was their obligation to go to a place the gospel would call the other side. In ancient history, when one referred to the other side, it was always to reference the place where those other people lived. That other side in Selma on the way to Montgomery was the rural South. And African Americans took their very lives into their hands to cross over, to go through and into the other side. I welcome you to hear the Gospel of Mark this morning with that memory of our modern history in mind. On that day when evening had come, Jesus said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were there with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves began to beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, indifferent, as if he were asleep, laying on the cushion. And they rousted him up, and they said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke, stood up, honored the wind, and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. And he said to the students, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said one to another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea would hear him?" This is good news if we would choose to hear it. And from the hand of Lucille Clifton, a wonderful African-American poet, who asks us this morning to do something I will ask you to do again in just a moment, and that is to reimagine Eve. Most of us come today with some sense of the story we have been told is true about the woman who lived in the Garden of Eden. Would you risk yourself this morning to imagine her differently? This is Eve thinking. It's wild country here. Brothers and sisters are coupling, claw and wing groping one another. I wait while the clay two-footed one rumbles in his chest, searching for language to call me. But he is slow. Tonight, as he sleeps, I will whisper into his mouth our names. Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model. Born in Babylon, both non-white and a woman. What did I see to be except myself. So I made it up. Here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight my other hand, come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. I want to speak this morning about innocence. Innocence is our theme for these 6 weeks following the festival of Epiphany, that time of discovery, the time in which we are welcomed in the darkness of winter to reach down into the soil of our lives, into those places which are still yet a bit dark, and imagine something new and powerful that we might germinate into a springtime. I want to speak with you about the possibility that innocence is something more than we have imagined. Something more than we have been led to believe by the old religion and traditional morality. That innocence is not a delicate flower, some white linen, dewy, meadowed, childlike flower that needs to be protected from its fragileness. That indeed innocence is a deep and primordial power that lived in Eve and lives in us. That innocence is not something we can lose. It, like a soul, can only either be grown, expanded, or ignored and allowed to wither and decay. And the expansion of something I want to call a knowing innocence is the key to unleashing the greatest human expansions of consciousness that are yet to come. And that if you find that I'm right about any of this morning, it has made then a calling on our life to pay attention to our innocence. Because it is our innocence which is essential to a deep happiness and also the key to the power that indeed can change the world. That's a tall order. So we'll lighten it up a bit with some fun I got to have this week. I had a real treat this week. I got to go to the movies. I haven't seen an $11 first-run, big screen, expensive popcorn movie in like 15 years. I have 7 people in my family. That's $100. Not gonna happen. So this week, it was just me, all by my lonesome on the big screen, Theater 1 with my smuggled popcorn. Because I can't eat the stuff they sell at the concession stand. And I got to see Selma. How lucky am I to have been chosen to preach this week, months ago, and that movie came out this week. I'm living right somewhere. I was an infant when Selma happened, all of 1 year old. So I have no direct experience of that moment in American history where millions watched in horror on their television. And something that many of them described to me as the loss of their innocence happened about Jim Crow and about voters' rights. Those who were actually there, folks like Bill Moyers, who I follow his near every word, would suggest that maybe the film has a problem here or there with some of its details, but no one doubts that this film is a unique and powerful window into the spiritual emotion of this moment in time, it was really much more than I hoped for. It was a moment that revealed to me this idea that innocence is not fragile, that it is, in fact, one of the most powerful things in the world, and it is our calling, like Dr. King's, to grow into it and to inspire through a fully knowing kind of innocence the liberation of the world. I am what you would say is legally innocent of Selma. I did not sit in front of the TV. I did not read the headlines. But one of the things this film helped me to understand is that violent ignorance was not the last word on the bridge and with the people at Selma. America did not lose its innocence on that bridge. Its innocence finally broke through its naivete. And this is the different kind of innocence I want to explore with you this morning. This film has called me to the other side of my own innocent naivete about Selma and its message for America and for the world. And because I have now seen it, I am responsible to it. I am forced to choose. Choose whether or not to step into this knowledge of both the good and the evil of this moment in time. Choose whether to be responsible for it. To expand my own innocence like a soul expanding. Or will I choose to pretend Selma away? Because it is not convenient. It is not comfortable. It is ugly. And not just among those who stood to support Jim Crow and the denial of the vote. It is a messy business for everyone. But let's be clear about what I'm meaning by innocence. To do this, we're going to need to do that thing we do well at Fountain Street Church, which is to throw off the shackles of our Puritan past. Roots which have taught us that innocence is somehow fragile and about simple naivete. But there are really two kinds of innocence. There is the one that is familiar to many of us that has to do with a legal kind of innocence, guilty or not guilty. It's about a relationship to the rules. The assumption is that if you follow the rules, things will be better. How's that working for you? Follow the rules of the gods, of the powers, of those who are in control of your life's freedoms, and everything will be just fine. We know better. But there is another kind of innocence, and it is rooted in the history and the etymology of the word itself. I was stunned to explore this week. If we press back into the language, the word innocence comes from Latin, innocentia, and it means literally, listen to this, it means the power not to harm. Innocence is a power, and its effect is non-harming. It is similar to the Eastern idea, for those of you who may practice Buddhism or Hindu practice, of an idea called ahimsa, which means non-harm as well. It's very familiar to those of us who practice yoga. Non-harm is the idea that as one's consciousness expands, one's awareness of reality, that there is a corresponding responsibility not to harm the world or to allow harm to come to others. Innocence, then, is about active, non-harming. It is the very core of Dr. King's nonviolent leadership of the civil rights movement. It is all about a knowing, powerful innocence. But innocence is not a static thing. It is not something we're given at birth and it's simply there. It is small when we first receive it. Even if, when we first receive it, we may have some gifts in this regard. I have a son like this. I don't know if he's in the house this morning, but he's going to have to forgive me now because I'm about to tell a story on him. My son Chris, when he was about 3, had a magical kind of innocence about him. He was capable of exploring things that were against every kind of social rule, mostly the unspoken ones. It wasn't a defiance. It was, are you really doing that? Because nobody does that. And when you see this, it is powerful and marvelous, isn't it? It is the beginning of that childlike kind of innocence. When one day I came home from work and Chris was out in the backyard and I saw him there in the sandbox, but I didn't pay much attention. He was often in the sandbox, but all of a sudden I could hear from the sandbox this gigantic belly laughter, the kind of wailing and squealing of ecstatic joy that only a 3-year-old with like 100 pounds of childhood fat can make happen. Oh, it was so fast. I had to go out. I had to go out and find out what was it that was bringing this much joy into the world. And as I turned the corner to come into the backyard, there is my son with his pants pulled out as far as he can reach them and a toy shovel, and he is filling his pants with sand. To the legs were full out in the belly, and each bucket full was just filled with a kind of ecstatic joy, like, I can't believe it's this good. That's the kind of transcendent of a social order that you don't fill your pants with sand. But he didn't know. So I asked him, Chris, why is this so wonderful to you? And he said, well, I'm just experimenting. Well, Chris, what are you experimenting with? What pants are for? Of course, because nobody told him what pants are for. At 3, Chris appropriately had no idea of the social constructs that would make such a practice seem, at a minimum, odd. He was legally not guilty, legally innocent of breaking that social order, because he was naive, he was inexperienced, he was unknowing of the rules. And in general, and I'm going to need to ask all the attorneys to relax for just a moment, society generally does not prefer to find people guilty of things they don't know they're doing wrong. Chris was not willingly ignorant. He was just fabulously open to a kind of creative power that led him to break a social order. This is the beginning of innocence unleashed into the world. But something happens, doesn't it? And it happens, and it has happened to every one of us. We grow up, and we have experience, and we get broken. And we gain awareness of the rules and how in some ways it's helpful just to get along. And this can lead us to the great lie that society's current order, its current rules, are somehow eternal, that they have always been with us, that they are divinely given. Such an assumption is a total failure of innocence, the power not to harm. It is the kind of failure of innocence which allowed people in the rural South and some in the North to boot, and still to this day to believe that somehow there is an eternal, divinely given, written in the book kind of requirement for slavery, for oppression, for Jim Crow, for voter oppression. And it took a knowing, powerful, I want to suggest almost transcendent kind of innocence to break through this harmful social order. This is an innocence that was not naive, but clearly aware of the rules and the order of things, an innocence that was willing to defy the gods of the social order while never compromising non-harm as a pillar of their practice. This was the way of Martin Luther King and the people who marched from Selma to Montgomery. Where does this come from? And can we get in on it? I say yes. I don't know the origins and the development of Martin Luther King Jr.'s powerful, transcendent innocence. But I do know he was a biblical man. And if we look at the creation story, the story to which the poetry this morning pointed, that story of Adam, the dirt one, and Eve, her name in Hebrew is the divine fire window. Watch out, guys. You are dealing with serious business here when you're dealing with Eve. If we look into this creation story, what we see, if we are willing to move out of a childlike innocence, is a witness to the very kind of innocence I suggest King brought to the world. And her name is Eve. Eve is not a hero. She's not even innocent. She caused the fall. She is guilty of original sin. She broke the rules. Yeah. Stay with me. The old religion wants us to believe that Eve is not just naive, but really Eve is bad. She is guilty. And that she possesses some kind of a dangerous power to disobey the gods who said, "Don't you eat that fruit. Don't you grab for that freedom called knowledge." Is Eve guilty of moral failure? Or is she, like King, the archetype of a powerful, knowing innocence? There is another way to understand Eve, another way to understand innocence, and another way to understand the entire story of Eden. What if Eve is a heroine, the great heroine of Eden, the one who would risk it all to overcome the social order of the jealous gods, the one who, for each of us, reached for the knowledge of all that is good and all that is broken. Eve reveals to us this kind of innocence that combines a childlike ability to imagine with the powerful responsibility to challenge the social order which is harming the world. She breaks the rules while not harming another. And in doing so, I suggest she does not condemn us, but she sets us free. To call Eve a heroine, we must believe that knowing good and evil, all of it, is the highest human calling. We must believe that Eve does not commit original sin, but instead commits an act of original innocence. We must be willing to do the personal work of undoing 2 millenniums worth of theological teaching that says breaking the rules is a bad idea, always. We must begin to celebrate not only those who question the rules, but those who are willing to set forth their lives and to pay the price in order to set others free. All of which leads me back to that bridge in Selma. And the most powerful moment of the whole film, and I really do hope you go get to see this. This moment awakened me to this idea that innocence is like a soul, and it is each of our callings to grow it as powerful as our circumstances would allow for the liberation of others. The marchers had suffered a terrible violence at their first attempted crossing, let loose upon by dogs and horses and men with whips as if it were 1765. And so when it came time for a second march, with no assurance that the same kind of violence would not be unleashed upon the marchers, King himself leads the march, walking with hundreds of clergy, thousands of people, all willing to practice an Eve-inspired Garden of Eden kind of innocence, both full of transcendent power and the will to imagine a change in the social order, willing to pay the price to reach for the fruit called freedom, no matter what the gods had said the consequence. And so the state police lined up at the other side of the bridge as they had before, blocking the road at the end of the bridge, which would allow them to cross over to the other side, to the place where those other people lived. And when the march reached the middle of the bridge, the state troopers inexplicably part, almost like the Red Sea, and they open the way. And they were either inviting the march or they were daring them to march. We will never know. But as the troops parted, King stopped the march and knelt down, grounding himself in a moment which invited the thousands who were with him to do the same. And without asking for it, it's clear that what happened in the middle of that bridge is that King welcomed them all to pray. And this is where I sense we see most potently an extraordinary, powerful, knowing innocence at work. A knowing innocence which honors non-harm as its core, without giving up the call to freedom. And so out of this prayerful moment, King rises up and he turns around and he walks the people off the bridge. What? Why would he choose to seize defeat from the hands of victory? Why? Even his own people became deeply troubled by this failure to overcome, to win. But what I suggest is that some level King remembered his innocence and his responsibility to it. He had won. There was no need to humiliate the enemy, to press them down as they had been pressed down by marching past them defiantly. No domination would add to the victory already in hand. And this is where we, as men and women dedicated to a deeper meaning and a greater value in our days, must take up this very same way of practicing a powerful yet non-harming innocence in the world. We can choose to practice this, each and every one of us. Where in your days, right now, is there a bridge of discord between you and the social order? And where within it might you, instead of attempting to dominate, might you kneel down and welcome those who would march with you to pray? Where in your life is there the possibility to seize dominant power by being right, by being dominant? And can you call forward a more developed kind of innocence which says we can all get to the other side? I do not have to make you smaller to make us all larger. Such a practice is not easily won. It must begin in the smallest places in our lives, in the simplest of disagreements. It's going to take time. How much time? And let us hear, as I close this morning, the wisdom of Dr. King as he delivered the speech after a 50-mile march from Selma to the Montgomery Capitol. He suggested that it's not going to be too long. I come to you this afternoon, however, at the moment, however frustrating the hour, knowing it will not be long, because truth crushed to the earth will rise again. How long? Not long. Because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long, because you shall reap what you sow. How long? Not long, my friends, because the arc of the moral universe is long, and it will bend towards justice. May it be so. Not just for a story from the past, but in our lives this week, that you might grasp the power of the innocence that Eve has invited you to remember, and that you might make it so powerful in the world that the freedom of others would be the fruit of your life. May it be so, and amen.
Songs we're meant to sing while we're young. Every day is spring while we're young. None can refuse. Time flies so fast. Too dear to lose and too sweet to last. Though it may be just for today, share our love. So blue the skies, all sweet surprise shines before our eyes while we're young. So blue the skies, all sweet surprise shines before our eyes while we're young.